what I want to do is just give a kind of progress update about where we got to so far, and give a little bit about where we're heading to in future. So I think we're all here. I think Lee and Andy are in the meeting as well. And so our project is about the economic and education implications of what's happened under the crisis, and trying to assess that in a systematic way, both in terms of immediate impacts and also to think about longer run impacts in terms of economic and education scars that might result from the shocks that people have faced during the crisis. Okay, so I'm just going to jump straight in. I've got quite a few slides, and I think they're in the pack. So I'm going to go through them quite fast. We'd welcome any feedback and input from anybody about what we're talking about today. Okay, so the focus of what we've been doing so far is to look at the scale and distribution of learning and labour market losses that have arisen under the crisis. And it turns out that both of these are very unevenly distributed because the inequality of both education and labour market outcomes has increased and been magnified since in the last year or so. In terms of its inequality, losses have been higher amongst younger people, and they've tended to exacerbate already existing inequalities. There's gender differences, and in the labour market, low-wage workers have been differentially affected, and the self-employed have been hit particularly hard by what's happened. Okay, so in terms of the project, we're focusing on two closely related aspects of inequality that have resulted from the COVID-19 induced crisis. The first of that is to use a range of different data sources, both primary and secondary data, so bespoke surveys that we've undertaken ourselves and secondary data that's been collected since lockdown, to document both the inequality of labour market and learning losses in a unified framework that looks at both. The second, which we've done less on so far, is to actually think about what's going to happen in the future in terms of trying to evaluate the consequences for social mobility for people who've been affected more heavily in terms of their economic and education outcomes. So today I'm just going to talk really about number one. I'll just say a little bit at the end about what we're doing in terms of number two. So we've assembled evidence from a number of primary and secondary data sources. What we've done so far is looked at both the regular cross-section and longitudinal aspects of the issues using the labour force surveys. We've used the Understanding Society dedicated COVID waves, and we've undertaken our own surveys. We've now undertaken two, one last September and one where we've just got results from January and February from this year. We've also now got the access to SRS, but we haven't yet done anything under the rapid response grant, and we haven't yet done anything with the data sources in there, although we've got the access all sorted out completely, and it's all looking great in terms of that. Okay, so in terms of what we want to do, the main criterion for our analysis is that we want for individuals a pre-COVID, pre-lockdown baseline. So one of the requirements we need for data is to have information from January or February 2020, and we want to use that as a baseline so we can follow people longitudinally and see what happens to them at various stages through the crisis, particularly at the different stages of lockdown. So far, this is what we've done. We've got the survey structures in panel B here for the labour market outcomes we're interested in. So we're using the Labour Force Survey, Understanding Society, and our own social mobility survey. And on education, thus far, we've been looking at Understanding Society and again our own survey. So the ticks tell you where we can do where we've done the analysis so far. We will be extending this to cover other data sources as well. So one very important thing here is if we're thinking about looking at labour market outcomes and education outcomes, there's some extremely important measurement issues that arise for at least two reasons. One, because the current crisis is working differently from previous economic downturns and recessions. Another is because of the differences in government policy this time around compared to economic downturns of the past. So measurement of labour market and learning impacts very much needs to reflect this. It very much matters to think about what's going on here. And I'll show you evidence on this in the slides that follow. So in terms of the labour market, it turns out we're looking at conventional employment or unemployment rates really does not show the full labour market impact of what's happened under the crisis. And there's at least two reasons for that. One of which is the government's furlough scheme, the job retention scheme, which actually means that people are being kept in employment formally. So of course, when they answer the question about labour market status in, for example, the labour force survey, they say they're in work. But it actually turns out that for many people, their labour market involvement has been very limited. And in actually many cases, actually zero. So whilst they're still in jobs, they've actually not been working at all. So we need a capacity-based measure rather than simply using standard employment population ratios or the share of the unemployed in the working age population. A second dimension is the self-employed have been hit particularly hard, and that needs to be reflected in the labour market outcomes as well. There's a parallel again in terms of learning. Schools and universities and colleges have been closed. There's been a shift to online learning becoming the norm. And actually, we don't really have, whilst we do have evidence on labour market outcomes from earlier recessions that we can draw upon, we don't really have anything to the scale of what's happened in terms of school and higher education institution closures. So again, measures of school attendance, college attendance, which we might have used before to try and infer something about learning losses, are just not adequate again. So again, we need some capacity-based measure of learning if we're going to think about measuring learning losses accurately. And I'll show you how we do that from the data that we've got in a moment. Okay, there's a lot of numbers on here, and I'm just going to tell you very fast, but this is just to show you how if you look at the aggregate employment rate, the same would apply if you looked at the unemployment rate. Actually, you don't really get the kind of picture of exactly what's going on. So the first three columns of this table just show you for each month of 2019 and 2020, aggregate employment rates from the labour force survey for people aged 18 to 64 who are not in full-time education. And so you can see the changes given there in the third column. And whilst you see some negative signs saying that employment is lower, the employment rate is lower in 2020 compared to 2019, the scale of a change is really modest. The same is true if you look at the unemployment rate. And this is, of course, because the furlough has kept people formally in employment, and some of the self-employment and income support schemes have kept the self-employed in. If you actually look in the middle three columns at actual hours worked, you see huge falls going on between 2019 and 2020 in the same month. So when lockdown first hit, you can see that average hours worked per week was 7 hours, 6.9 hours down compared to the previous April. And you can see that as you progress through the year, things get better as we came out of lockdown and back into lockdown and then out of lockdown and back into lockdown again. But you see very, very sharp falls in hours worked. So the final column here gives you what we call a realistic employment rate, where we actually calculate the employment rate as those people who are actually employed and working positive hours. So we put the 0 hours into not working. And you see a huge fall in these realistic employment rates, 17 percentage points in April, getting better as we progress through the year, but still down even by December. So this is shown on a chart here, just so you can see what's going on. So the left-hand chart here shows you pretty much what I just showed you there for 2020. And so the green bar is these people who are employed but not working any hours in the week before in the survey in the labour force. So their actual hours are 0, even though they're formally employed. Why is this useful? Well, if you look at the right-hand column here, this shows you what's happened in previous downturns. It shows you 2019, and then it shows you the 1981 recession, the 1991 recession, and the 2008 recession. And if you look for a green bar there isn't anything at all. You can see, if you actually peer very, very closely at 2019, there's a little bit of a green bar, and that's actually the people who were on 0-hour contracts, who actually didn't work in the week before the survey in the LFS. Of course, there was far fewer 0-hour contracts in the early recessions, and so you can see that actually the bulk of all of the action there was on unemployment, whereas here now you need to think about people who are employed and not working. Okay, the young have been hit even harder. And this is one of the inequalities that's really is of importance, as have the self-employed, as both these charts are showing. And so there is variation in the labour market losses that have occurred. So that's the cross-sectional analysis we've done from a labour force survey. The school attendance, the DFE has been collecting information on school attendance. You know, this is extremely valuable again for showing what's happened. So under lockdown, you can see that hardly anybody was initial lockdown, hardly anybody was going to school. The children of key workers and some vulnerable children were going to school. And there was a little bit of an opening up from June 2020, where some year groups were going back to school to a certain extent. Then we opened up back in September, although the proportion going to school never got back to what it would normally be. It was bobbing around about 85%. And then in the second half term, in autumn, it went down again because various children were sent home to socially isolate. And then we had a lockdown since again here, and now children went back to school in March. And so this is obviously going to have implications for calculating learning losses as well. Okay, let me just go quickly through the longitudinal analysis we've done. So this is now when we look at this benchmark of having information on people in February, and then tracking to see who lost their jobs, who was formerly employed but not working any hours, and everybody who was out of work by summing the two together. So you can see under lockdown from the longitudinal LFS, about 30% of people were not working, about 3% had lost their jobs. Job loss progresses as we go through across the table. You can see more people have been losing their jobs. And so there is a worry about what's going on with unemployment. And of course, there's a serious worry about what will happen when the furlough and the self-employment support schemes are wound down as well. So one of our key things about labour market losses and labour market scarring is we really do need to figure out how to make sure people do not get on trajectories towards long-term unemployment. We know from previous recessions just how bad experiences of long-term unemployment are for the individuals themselves, for their families, and for their communities. And so this really is top priority for policy. Certainly when the support schemes get wound down. Okay, so you can see here again. It's sort of interesting that when we went into lockdown, according to our most recent data in January and February of 2021, but actually job loss bounces back up again, as does the number of people who are employed and working 0 hours. These is just some simple regressions, statistical regressions to show variations across different groups of people. I don't have time to talk about them in detail, but this very much pulls out that some people have experienced higher labour market losses than others. In particular, the young have done pretty badly in terms of not having work and losing their jobs, and in terms of earnings losses. Women have done badly in terms of not working and in terms of experienced earning losses. And the self-employed have been hit very hard in terms of their earnings. This is true both in September 2020 and in January 2021. The other thing that's interesting is if you look at the last two rows, the bottom income quintile when growing up and the top income quintile when growing up, there's also an inequality effect across generations that's going on here. And it seems like people from poorer backgrounds have been hit more in terms of experiencing higher labour market losses, both in terms of work and in terms of earnings in the period of a crisis. We have a parallel analysis for learning losses that we've done. So I need to tell you just a little bit how we measure this. So both in Understanding Society and in our social mobility survey, we collected information, well, we collected it in our survey and ONS did for Understanding Society, on the fraction of the day spent learning under lockdown and when children went back to school. And so we've got a range of no learning at all, so 0 hours per day learning, to full learning, which would be the same amount as expected in school. So there's a big inequality of these measures. And then we have between 0 and 1, we have a range of percentage points as well. So we can calculate the percentage learning loss. So take the first column there in April 2020 under first lockdown. So 25% of children, school children aged 5 to 18 did no learning at home at all. 38% had full learning, and then the remainder are in between. And so we've calculated the average learning loss is 57.6%. From what's happened. So 42, so if you want the capacity-based measure, it would be 100 minus that at 42%. So 40% of usual learning was going on under lockdown. This improves when children go back to school, very reassuringly. But again, when we come to the third lockdown and when the schools were shut from after Christmas, again, you see that the learning losses re-emerge again. They're not quite as marked, but they're still there as well. So this is sort of pretty much unprecedented, the scale of these learning losses. They are also unequally distributed. And so the key characteristics here are differences between primary school children and secondary school children, between girls and boys, girls doing better this time, and inequality in terms of family background is very marked. That people in the bottom income quintile have bigger learning losses, and people in the top income quintile have lower learning losses. Okay, so that's where we've got to so far. So just the conclusions we would reach from that so far is that work and education was significantly affected and continue to be affected following the onset of the crisis. The observed changes have not been shared equally. Those who've done worst are those who were doing less well pre-lockdown, and particularly hard hit have been the young, both in terms of jobs and education. Women, the solo self-employed, I didn't distinguish between the solo self-employed and the self-employed with workers before, but a key thing is it's self-employed individuals who are own account workers who are just working by themselves, and people from poorer backgrounds. Now, it's been well established in work that's in a whole body of research in the social sciences. The twin drivers of low social mobility are higher educational inequalities and higher income inequalities. So both of these have risen during the crisis. And so what we want to move on to next, and we've already started computing various calibrations from a model to do this, is to figure out what the implications for social mobility are. And it seems like increased intergenerational inequalities look set to emerge unless the learning losses, both learning and labour market losses, both in the short term and from potential scarring effects in the longer term, can be mitigated in some kind of way. Okay, so that's where we got to so far.